Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to our first webinar of the 2026 Ask an Expert series on the topic Accelerating Time to Value with SaaS. For speakers, we have with us today Lulu Wright, who's the manufacturing business consultant. And then we also have Jellum, the industry principal. Here is a quick safe harbor disclaimer about the content that we will be using on this webinar session today. Some housekeeping items on how you can navigate the webinar tool. If you have any questions, please use the question button that you see to enter any questions you have for our speakers, and we will answer them on the end. If you need any technical assistance or you need to contact our team, you can click on the green button and contact us directly from there. You can access any additional resources, which includes our 2026 Ask an Expert landing page with our upcoming webinar episodes, as well as any relevant additional content from the hyperlink button that you see on your side. So that's how you can access all of those additional content. If you need to contact our speakers today, you can do that as well through the number 4 button that you see on your side. And then there will be a feedback survey in the end, just so that we can communicate with you accordingly after the webinar. And with that, I will pass it to Lee.
Thank you, Aroni. Hi, my name is Lee Jellum, and today we're going to talk about accelerating time to value with SaaS solutions. So some of the key items that we're going to cover today are the outlook. What is a SaaS outlook? What are the key considerations? Then we'll jump into deployment, lessons learned from deployment, and adoption. So basically from start of the project to the end of the project, some of the things that really matter. So let's take a look at why it matters in manufacturing solutions. All right, so first, why invest in manufacturing solutions? Interesting data point here is that less than 1% of the data is available as operational information. So if you think of the leaky pipe analogy, you have all this data, and at various steps along the way, it's leaking out of that pipe, and you're only able to get access to a certain amount by the time it gets to that pipe. So everything from data capture or not being captured to data not being streamed or stored to not being accessible to the right people at the right time, and analytics and AI, being able to run those. Is the data available to the system to do that? Is it available for making decisions? So that's really where it gets down to that last 1%. So this is obviously key part to getting time to value, is actually having accessibility to the data. So then once we have the data, so what are we going to do with it? How are we going to plug all of those holes in that leaky pipe? So first, let's do a quick review, make sure everyone understands what SaaS is. So the definition of SaaS is a software delivery model where applications such as Proficy Smart Factory are hosted by a provider and made available to customers over the internet. Users are able to access the software through a web browser, and one of the key benefits to that is really eliminating the need for installation and system maintenance on their local machines or even in their private cloud. So who is deploying SaaS? What are the industry trends? And pulled some research here and found an interesting statistic. I have some of the statistics I've seen from just our Proficy Smart Factory SaaS solution. But what we're seeing from an industry perspective, some of the trends are showing that that SaaS-based MES solutions will grow to 47% of deployments by 2030. So that's just short period time of way, and there's data behind that. That doesn't even include the hybrid solution. So this is pure SaaS solutions as opposed to hybrid or even on-premises solutions. And the reasons for that are, lower upfront costs, reduced deployment complexity, so you can quickly have a system available and ready to configure and deploy. And it eliminates that siloed data where you're going to various systems within a plant or even different plants to be able to pull that together and basically standardize your operations across your plants. So now we know what the trends look like. Why are manufacturers moving to the cloud? So here are the top 9 reasons that we've seen that folks move to the cloud. It's really to get accessibility to that data, span the enterprise to get site-by-site type information consolidated into a single location, so you have a single truth of data, and then replicate best practices across your equipment, across your lines, across your sites. And of course, everyone wants to, throw AI at the most difficult problems they're having. So having the data accessible to train on and to create an algorithm to deploy an analytic to solve some of those problems. Cost, performance, and then faster time to value. This whole section is really about faster time to value. So we want to talk about the value itself, but also how do you get to that value faster? I think that's one of the key things. I think the value's fairly well known, but how do you decrease everything down? And SaaS helps with that. Scalability, being able to take your solutions and scale it across the enterprise, even if it's just small, single solution that you want to take and deploy across sites to make accessible to multiple users, highly valuable to have a platform that does that. And then how do you maintain that? How do you upgrade? And how do you ensure security? Those are all some of the reasons why people are going to SaaS, because those are provided in a single solution, and you don't need to have that staff of experts for each individual component. So some of the considerations, the key elements that you really should be looking at can be thought of as 4 different pillars. Everything from solution capabilities, like are you trying to do manufacturing execution, or is it just data storage? Are you trying to plan and schedule? You also need to consider the platform capabilities. And the 3rd pillar is that infrastructure and the total cost of ownership of the infrastructure to drive those solutions. And then the 4th pillar is the solution lifecycle. And that's looking at everything across the time horizon to support and maintain that solution. So let's jump in the bottom one first, that solution lifecycle. So to accelerate the time to value at every step of the solution lifecycle, everything from rollout to deployment to installation and upgrades, need to consider these for that. And that's where SaaS really has its benefits to each one of these steps, being able to simplify, replicate best practices. The next pillar up is the infrastructure and total cost of ownership. So if you look at what expertise and time do I have available for my resources if I'm a manufacturer, what are those, what time commitment is required? So you might want to look at the different levels of system management that is required between an on-premises, a cloud VPC, virtual private cloud, or even a SaaS solution. So obviously on the far right, SaaS solution, most of that is managed by the provider. On the far left, if you do it on premises, then you've got to have a little more expertise and capability to procure the hardware, the servers, maintain the servers, set up the networking, ensure the security, the private networks, and whatever also required. and then all the way up to the typical things you think of from the operating systems and the applications and data that you're storing. So obviously a key consideration is that infrastructure and what are the costs associated with that, not just from the initial project, but for the life cycle of that project, that program. Third is the platform capabilities. These are 7 capabilities that are typically looked at that you want to consider when you're looking at manufacturing solutions. So these include, from the upper, working your way clockwise, the scalability and availability, the security, risk management, data management. You've got to have integration to the plant floor systems as well as the business systems, and system monitoring and notifications when things aren't working well, and then the ability to do continuous improvement of those applications. So those are key platform capabilities. And then the 4th pillar are the solution capabilities. So on the far right-hand side, these are very common manufacturing use cases that need to be solved. Everything from finite capacity scheduling, what lines you have, what resources are available, raw materials available, when the due dates are, getting those all set up and running specific orders on a line. Then it drops into execution. What are you going to produce? How many are you going to produce? What are the steps to produce it? Third is keeping track of your raw material and finished goods and any work in process, and tracking that inventory and genealogy, as well as the compliance associated with that. 4th is your quality tests, in-process quality tests. Make sure that you're making the right products at the right time, and reducing waste by notifying folks before you actually run into out of conformance issues, before it gets too far down that value chain, because it costs more for every step in the value chain that waste goes through. And then finally, performance, your productivity and your production performance, and your KPIs. All right, so for accelerating that time to value, you really want to make sure that you're delivering value. So it's important to define what those key performance indicators are in advance, and to measure the realized value that you're achieving over time, and it will change over time. So make sure you have the right KPIs set up in advance, and that you track those on a periodic basis. And that's really how you can measure the value and shorten that time to value when you're looking at scaling the solution across. With that said, the value, we perform value assessments, so please feel free to reach out to me or Lulu if you want to look at value at your site and what some of those KPIs are. We do value assessments with customers and partners, so happy to conduct one of those for you in the near future as well. So that's an introduction to some key elements. So now let me pass it over to Lulu for how you can actually accelerate the SaaS solution deployments and adoption as the next steps.
Thank you, Lee. And you're going to hear me basically give maybe further details, but really talk into a lot of the main points that Lee has set out for us during the first portion of this webinar. And if we talk about deployment, right? What is it that we're going to be focusing on how can we make this faster, less risky, more impactful, more valuable? So one way that or one main aspect that our services team prioritizes is staying out of the box as much as possible. Why? If we're thinking about the simplification of being able to roll out to additional sites, being able to deploy faster, this means you're not going to be maybe focusing too much on extensibility of the software in this case, making it easier to maintain and upgrade the system. as well as, of course, leveraging the experience and the tight working relationship between our product and services teams. And this goes hand in hand with, again, like Lee mentioned, having a plan, having a strategy. You have the idea of trying to accelerate. Maybe let's try to optimize by trying to use as much out of the box as possible and leveraging all this expertise. But how do we get started, right? Um, as usual, you will have your order first in your client kickoff. You will have your planning, you have your architecture, right? Depending on how you do it, you're going to have your requirements, you're going to have your design. Um, and this is where you're going to try to set up the stage so that you're thinking as much as possible beforehand of things that could down the road mean, schedule changes or delays and things like that. And an example of this would be, for example, I have seen a few times where maybe integration with other systems or platforms was not something that was discussed early on during the project, and then comes the time when that is something that is needed, that will take a little bit of time to, again, go back to how do you want to handle it? Do you have the right resources? Do you have the right training? And so on and so forth. Once we get started and we know where we're going and everybody's aligned, you go from the design to your build stage. So that would be your true deployment, your system configuration. In the case of server, right, that is something that we take care of. Then any sort of additional tasks that need to be done, whether it is that you're having a bit of software extensibility, then you want to, of course, make sure that you're testing that this works, that this makes sense, that you are engaging, your main internal champion and users, as well as your super users, right? Could it be your operators, your supervisors? Oftentimes, this will come down to, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well during training, but you can have something like a train the trainer, and you can have supervisor roles first get training, and then they can go on and do this with operators and plant floor resources. So making sure everybody is integrated into this, and then the actual deployment of the software going live. After this, we go from the execution and delivery into handover and closure. Now, something important here, and we see it at the bottom, is the monitor and control. We want to make sure that throughout this process, right, is very dynamic, and things are there are going to be changes on the client side, on our side, making sure we have the right resources, that the schedule and the different timelines align, that if there's any change order management that needs to happen, that is, all of these things are being taken care of proactively. Of course, risk and issue management and project health reporting. Now, how can we do it more efficiently? How can we do it faster? How can we be more impactful? A way to do this that plays very well with SaaS is the multi-site approach. With our latest software release, you have the option or the possibility to have multiple sites within one environment. So, what does this mean? Let's say you have 10, 15 plans that have similar, if not, very, very close processes to one another. Then this means that you don't have to continue putting in the same amount of effort and work into each one of these deployments. Let's focus on one of them. Let's figure out what it takes to get one of these plans into Smart Factory and to get the value that you need. And this could be, a high percentage of the work that you would need to put in to get plan number 2, number 3, number 15 to get it to go live. Now, the process, we've just been through it, right? You're still going to design. When you're building thinking of a template. You still are going to go through the testing and validation and then deployment at this first site. Now, what happens is when time comes to get started on site 2 or site 3, or even sometimes you can do a few in parallel, you already have a lot of this pre-work done and you can focus on the gaps, anything that may be slightly different, and move on faster. Now, a good thing for this also is that we find out as this happens more and more is you get some software guardrails. What does this mean? You may have very similar processes ran at different plants, but maybe because of different resources, different culture, different knowledge, there's things that are done slightly differently. Maybe the procedure is A, but then when you go and see in practice what this truly looks like or how it is executed, you find that there's slight differences. And this can be something that having this template can help with as well. In addition to that, you start having more and more knowledge within the company of the process and the software, and this can help increase the efficiency as well, not just thinking of clearly the design and the deployment stages, but also the adoption and then how to, once you adopt and once you execute the change management strategies, you're able to look into maybe level 2, level 3 of your journey and where you would like to ultimately be. Lessons learned. We do often get asked, it's large projects, oftentimes they involve resources from different levels of the organization, different departments, different organizations. How can we avoid, maybe common pitfalls? How can we maybe take advantage of standardized ways of our best practices? What do we look out for? What do we focus on? What do we try to avoid? So we did come up with a few of them to take into consideration. Clearly, there is a lot involved. And there's differences among different companies within the same company. Different plants around the world have different rules and regulations, and all of this plays a part. But if I may start with the last one, number 7, establish proper governance, metrics, and monitoring. Let's make sure that when we're initially designing and discussing and aligning on what we're solving for, we also know what we're going to be measuring as our KPIs. We also have a plan for monitoring so that you know the value that you're getting back. Once we're ready to begin, then let's think of this migration strategy. Do you already have something, maybe built in-house, maybe a different software, maybe you have years worth of data that you wouldn't like to lose? Then what does this look like? When do we do it? How do we do it? Do you just want to get what you have and try to use it as much as or as closer as it is as possible? Would you like to, or do you see the need to maybe have this ported over to newer technologies? These are all considerations that are great to think while we are in that initial design phase. Clearly, cost-benefit analysis is something that we go through with every one of these projects and implementations, but let's make sure we're also managing expectations within the different levels of the organization, that everybody knows and is aligned on what the needs are, what the process is going to be like, and what the value is to be expected. Identify skill gaps and invest in training. You want to make sure that once you have the solution, you're ready to go, right? That's why it is important that you think about this training. Like I mentioned, sometimes you do train the trainer. It may be online at your own pace. It may be live. But the idea is that you include this as part of your process, and this ends up playing a big part with change management and making sure everyone feels comfortable. Focusing on change management, like I just mentioned, is very closely related to number 3. We're talking about SaaS, right? There's make sure that you have robust security measures, there's clear roles, there's accountability, there's a process that is followed. List that there is planning for integration challenges. Like I mentioned before, oftentimes, right, we don't live in a vacuum and we want to communicate or interact with other software, then let's make sure this is part of the plan. How do we do this? Like we said, we first work on the discovery, making sure we're aligned. Lee mentioned the value assessment. Please feel free to reach out to us. This is something that we can also help with and have with different clients. Let's make sure we understand. Then, okay, let's work on the blueprint. How do we solve for those needs and requirements? Let's make sure we align on the value. Let's make sure we have a strategy and a plan. Then we move on to the deployment, development as needed. We check, we make sure we're ready for that go live. And here's where you start realizing, right, the value. We have your adoption enablement, you start to, you are live and you start to use the software, but let's not lose also focus of what happens next. How do we continue growing? How do we continue supporting you and getting to where you want to go? We can help also with enterprise acceleration plans. There are 4 main topics here: support and maintenance, education services that I've talked a little bit about, value services, some additional things over here. And I wanted to focus quickly on adoption and outcome services. You have a resource dedicated to making sure that you are successful, that the account is healthy, that there's a plan to monitor and to continue engaging with you, that there's escalation management, and of course, tracking of this ROI and the KPIs that were determined at the very beginning of the project, in addition to assistance with change management. An example of success here is Papa John's. They did not have a big IT group that could support the growth that they were looking to have. A lot of errors due to manual input and processes, no real visibility into real-time data, and inefficiencies. So talking to them became the option that made the most sense. Worked in the implementation, and almost immediately they were able to see the value in having access to this real-time data, in not needing to go out and get extra support to be able to maintain and support the system, and just having a lot of support coming, in this case, from our team, our cloud team. It helped them enhance their operational efficiency, clearly embrace digital transformation, but very importantly, be able to have the data that they needed in real time to make decisions that enabled them to continue to be flexible and have cost savings. In summary, make sure you're choosing the right technology. Make sure you're working with the right teams with your deployment. That you have a strategy in place. That you have ROI and KPIs that you are going to measure and make sure that you get the value that you're looking for, and also that you have an adoption strategy, change management, and that you're able to see the improvements that are being driven and measure them. Again, cloud adoption helps accelerate with traceability, with compliance, with agility, operational efficiency. And the idea is that you can do this while reducing the IT complexity, like we saw in the Papa John's example, and of course, enabling innovation. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to answer and to further discuss any of these topics. And here, Aroni, I'll pass it on to you.
Please use the Q&A button if you have any questions for us. I know we're a little over time, so we can squeeze in one question.
So I don't know if everyone could hear Aroni. I could barely hear it, but basically she said, if there are any questions, please enter them in the window on the side, and we have a short amount of time left for questions if there are any. If not, we really appreciate the time today, and please feel free to reach out to us as a follow-up if you have any more questions, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Ask an Expert session.
Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Looks like we do have one question, two questions. All right, great. So the first one that came in was basically said, what elements are typically considered when selecting a facility for a multi-site deployment? Lulu, do you want to take a stab at that, or do you want me to answer that?
There's different, like I said, I guess it depends, right, on the size, on the priorities, on where in the world the company is. But more often than not, you want to make sure that you have a good example maybe of what would be the level of complexity that you'd like to tackle. At the same time, you would like to be solving for something that is of value and a priority to the company, right? So let's make sure that you have, again, a good example of challenges that you would like to solve so that you can see how they can be solved through, the support collaboration, the software, in this case, Smart Factory SaaS, but also that you have something defined that you would like to solve for. Lee, I don't know if there's something else you'd like to add.
No, yeah, I think the question, yeah, I think that's good. I think a lot of times folks are looking for, do I try to pick a site that I start with that has all the difficult capabilities of that to make sure that I cover all my bases when I go to site 2 or site 3, and I typically like to take a different approach, do something that's more follows kind of the SMART principle, like you have something that's achievable and addresses most concerns most common, but you're going to be successful with that adoption and rolling out to the second site, third site. That's where you really start to see the value accumulate quickly, is when you get those most common themes and addressed and scaling it to additional sites versus trying to solve everything up front where yeah, from an engineering standpoint, you're solving problems, but from a value perspective, you're not really hitting the value that your organization wants to. Okay, and then there was, so the next question was a fairly long, so I'm going to abbreviate. Basically, I think it's referring to many sites require customization, that they're not necessarily the same from site to site to site. So that requires, the ability to create a template and using flexible low code, no code type alternatives to scale that across and deploy that and still have the benefit of a SaaS stable platform. So yeah, I think we have some best practices in place that we could share that we've seen from deployments that we're doing for the last 2 years, because obviously a SaaS platform you want to try to use out of the box, and you need to make sure that you have APIs that you can access that provide the information to meet your varying needs from varying equipment or lines or even sites. So one of the things I would say is that for common things, feed that back in through the Proficy engineering side, and with the right justification, those can become part of product after a period of time as well. And if there are any gaps, letting us know. But there's also standard ways of addressing any gaps in what you need from a capability standpoint. feel free to reach out to us to go on for the person asking the question to take that to the next step. And then the follow-up to that was how do we keep a customer to the standard smart factory? So I think I just described that a little bit. So there's obviously changes they have that they were looking that was maybe gaps and trying to fill those gaps, or look at ways of using existing APIs and other features in the software, properties, user-defined events, stuff like that, and some of the new technology that we're offering, GraphQL or whatever else, that makes that possible from a SaaS perspective, makes that being the customizations, the uniqueness between sites, and deploying those in a way that that can be standard and not custom one-off solutions. Great questions. With that, I think we're probably over. Feel free to respond back with more questions, though, and we'll be happy to answer those via email.
Thank you all. And also, you guys will be getting the recorded session of this webinar in an email after this session is over. So thank you all for attending today.
Thank you.